Well, our opening speaker and presenter is the Reverend Dr. Raphael G. Warnock, the senior pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Raphael's going to talk about what do we mean by the black church, and what has happened to the social justice tradition of the black church. And Raphael, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see all of you, particularly after Sunday morning. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Delman Coates, my friend and classmate from Union Seminary and Morehouse College, although we weren't really at Morehouse together.
Just a little.
For pulling us together in the way that he does, and for convening this meeting this morning. And I'm glad to be a part of this. Good to see so many friends around the table. What I want to do informally over the next few minutes is share some remarks from based on a book that will be published in November. New York University Press. I've got a book coming out entitled The Divided Mind of the Black Church. Theology, Piety, and Public Witness. The Divided Mind of the Black Church. And so I've shared this lecture recently at Yale and Colgate a couple months ago. I won't go through the whole thing this morning, but just sort of the heart of it as we try to get at this question of what's happened to the public witness in the black church. Where has it been, and how do we understand that historically and theologically? During the rough and tumble of presidential politics in 2008, what was for many Americans, black and white, a strange new term emerged in the national conversation: black theology. Owing to the pervasive reach of electronic media and the political machinations of powerful partisan interests caught up in a colossal contest for control over the most powerful nation on earth, millions of Americans, indeed people around the globe, were exposed to a 30-second clip of a fiery black preacher preaching to his own congregation on a Sunday morning. Extracted from its context and looped to the point of ad nauseum was the most provocative phrase you heard it over and over again: "Goddamn America." The black church, so central to black life, yet barely understood by mainstream America, was thrust to the center of the national dialogue. Part of the disconnect that happened in the conversation after Fox News and others made Jeremiah Wright's sermon famous, part of the disconnect was cultural, as those unexposed to the worship and the preaching of the black church sought to interpret the bombastic character of black prophetic preaching as it is buoyed and heightened in the hooping moment. Keon and others are better at that than me, by the emotive and exuberant response of those in the pews. In this way, there was a disconnect between black and white Americans, as the latter were televisually translated to a black church on any given Sunday morning, where preachers are expected, indeed encouraged, to speak the truth, to tell Pharaoh, to tell it like it is, with clarity, creativity, and passion. And so in that sense, Jeremiah Wright, whose sermon, by the way, if you haven't read the whole thing, is a very thoughtful and insightful piece on the relationship between God and government. It's a piece that I would situate in the continuum with St. Augustine's City of God, Martin Luther's temporal authority, to what extent it should be obeyed, the reflections of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his context. Some have situated him in the continuum of Malcolm, but I think it's Christian preaching at its best. It talks about the rub between who we are and our claims about God's kingdom. and our challenges to public policy on earth. Needless to say, the clip drew a lot of attention because Jeremiah Wright happened to be the pastor of Barack Obama, then the nation's only black senator. Think about that. We got two now, which is a record. Engaged in a formidable contest to become the first black president. The burning question within mainstream America was, what kind of church was this? What was the meaning of this kind of hate-filled preaching? Furthermore, what was the impact of this kind of preaching and this activist black church upon the worldview and the politics of this black man who would be president? Moreover, as much of America mused over doing the unthinkable, making a black man president of the United States and leader of the free world, the very notion of a decidedly black theology as it emerged in the discussion was not only strange and new, but frightening. Furthermore, for those who were beginning to open themselves up to the idea of a President Barack Obama, this strange black theology was most unwelcome in the new post-racial America that some believed had suddenly emerged. So some of the questions that were being asked in 2008 is, what is black theology? What is this black church? How had it shaped Senator Obama's worldview? Is this Barack Obama the 21st century version of the safer and more domesticated Martin Luther King Jr. created after the real Martin Luther King Jr. was killed? Or is he really Malcolm X in Martin Luther King's clothing? If not, why does he attend a church that teaches a decidedly race-conscious black value system and whose mantra is unapologetically Christian, unashamedly black? These were some of the questions that were circulating. Yet truthfully, if the Jeremiah Wright debacle revealed how little white Americans understood about the black church, it also underscored how little black people, even black church people, understood about black theology. The truth of the matter is that most black people, I would dare say, churched and unchurched, had never even heard of the term black theology, the critical and questioning side of the black Christian witness. This is because black theology has largely become an academic discipline, studied in seminary and discussed by scholars as they read papers to each other and critique each other in the meetings of the American Academy of Religion, the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and other regular forms of the Guild. This is the case today, but such was not black theology's origins. The reason, let me sort of telegraph to some degree where I'm going with this. The reason I'm underscoring this is part of my argument is that we have this disconnect, we have this diminishing of the black church's public witness because the black church is not clear about who it is. And the way you do that is you got to do theology. You got to have theologians who are critically engaged in the church. You got to have a connection between the church and which is the spiritual side where the proclamation happens, and then you got to have a critical theological apparatus that keeps the church honest about who it is. Otherwise, we don't know the difference between the black church and any other church. So, by the time the term black theology emerges in 2008, there's this disconnect. But that was not always the case. Black theology actually emerged as a product of the black church. It was shaped in its earliest institutional incarnation by black pastors who had their finger on the pulse of the streets and who, in a real sense, were called upon to give an accounting for their Christian identity, particularly by frustrated young African Americans in the inner cities who asked how could black preachers reconcile their Christian identity with their black identity as the nation reeled and rocked in the wake of the assassination of Dr. King. They were asking, what does it mean to be black and Christian? In this way, black theology was born not in the pristine labor and delivery room of the ivory tower, but in the ebony trenches and amidst the travail and tumult of burning cities and riot-torn streets. It is a critical theology that found its voice as black folk raised their voices with new clarity and power for freedom during the civil rights and black power movements of the 1960s. Yet, clearly by the time the term reemerged in the national conversation in the spring of 2008, the Sitzenleben, the life situation of black theology had changed, and the conversation was complicated by a deep disconnect, not only from mainstream white America, but from a deep and extended and continuing disconnect from the black church. Like long-lost siblings separated shortly after birth, black theology and the black church were awkwardly reintroduced to each other by outsiders who could hardly know the subtle and intimate nuances of their familial relationship under the hot glare of unceasing cable television coverage, partisan political posturing, and media hype. Moreover, the consequences of the disconnect between the black church and a critical theological principle, that's what's at stake in this for me, capable of keeping it honest about the radical implications of its liberationist heritage, could be further seen 4 years later in the response of many pastors to President Obama's announcement of support for marriage equality during the 2012 campaign. What is evident is that many black churches and their pastors are more influenced by the conservative tenets of white evangelicalism than their own history. And absent a self-conscious theological principle to thinking about the history of their own hermeneutical engagement of scriptures with respect to their own experience, black churches have too often been radical on race and conservative on almost every other issue. This is unfortunate and unnecessary because black theology is, in a real sense, the critical questioning side of the black church. It is a product of the black church, and the black church has been at its best, the conscience of the American churches. The emergence of each, that is, the emergence of the black church and the emergence of black theology, represent key moments in a long justice-making tradition as black people finding themselves trapped as chattel in a Christian slavocracy and later subjugated as second-class citizens in a caste system of Jim Crow segregation that was justified by the theology and the practices of white churches down south and up south, have endeavored to work out for themselves an anti-racist appropriation of Christian faith. So we talk about the prophetic voice of the black church. We don't need to romanticize this. Black church has always been a mixed bag. It has always been the site of what the late Manny Marvel called the ambiguous politics of the black church. Hans Baer calls it a stormy admixture of diverse responses to oppression, from conservatism to radicalism. So the black church has been a mixed bag. Yet at the center of our history, I would argue with Gerard Wilmore and others, has been something he called radicalism. There's been a liberationist thrust that comes throughout the history of the black church for good historical reasons. And this works itself out in different ways at different moments. And so I chart the history of the black church along 4 distinctive moments, I call them, in my upcoming book. And then I argue for a 5th, which I think what Delman is trying to do here precisely represents. So the first moment in the history of black Christian witness is the formation of a liberationist faith. The formation of a liberationist faith, or Christianization. That moment happens during the invisible institution, which was the black church prior to the institutional black church. That's the religion that was worked out in the brush arbors of Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. That was the meeting after the official meeting. Albert J. Rabbitoe, who still is the foremost authority on the subject. You can't talk about slave religion without referencing slave religion, even though the book was written in 1979. He said that the difference between the slave and the slave's religion and the slave master's religion was wide and deep. Howard Thurman said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. Dwight Hopkins calls it the co-constitution of the black self. That is to say that our ancestors received unto their African selves a Christian faith that was markedly different from what was given to them. That they weren't simply converted to Christianity, but they converted Christianity itself into a liberating faith. That's the first moment. The second moment is the founding of a liberationist church or institutionalization. The founding of a liberationist church or institutionalization. Lucretia Alexander, who was a slave, writes in her slave testimony, and I'm paraphrasing it pretty closely. She said that the master would come, or that is, the master's preacher would come, and he would say to us, don't steal your master's hogs. Don't steal your master's chickens. Do whatsoever your master said. And she said later at that night we'd have, she said, a real meeting with some real preaching. So that second moment represents the thrust of African Americans to have a real meeting with some real preaching. And so that's the independent black church movement, out of which the AME Zion Church emerges, Freedom Church, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, others. That's the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. That's First African Baptist Church down in Savannah, Georgia, where I'm from. Founded shortly after the founding of the nation. Amazing when I go down to Savannah and see on the cornerstone of a black church in Savannah, Georgia. I can't remember the exact year. Founded in 1781 or something. A site for the Underground Railroad. So that's the second moment. This group is familiar with that. I need not belabor it. The third moment, even though a lot happens, the purpose of laying out, a kind of taxonomy or heuristic framework as a scholar is the degree to which it has explanatory power. So a lot happens between that moment and what I call the third moment, but there's a reason why I lay it out this way. The third moment I call the fomenting of the church-led liberationist movement. The fomenting of the church-led liberationist movement. That's Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC and the Civil Rights Movement. Now, obviously, there were black activist preachers long before Dr. King and after Dr. King. In fact, as he carried out his ministry, his national and global ministry, he stood on the shoulders of preachers who came before him. He didn't have to look far. His own father, Martin Luther King Sr., led a voting rights campaign in Atlanta in 1935, demanding the franchise at a time when you could be lynched for much less. His maternal grandfather was an activist who fought for the first first high school for black students at a time when there was no high school. But I call this the third moment because no single factor has contributed more to the rising political consciousness of the black church and the search for the radical side of its mission than the ministry of Martin Luther King Jr. To be sure, his ministry stands within and not apart from the long saga of black struggle and the cultural history of the black church, but within the 20th century, King's prophetic voice and his public theology raised and refocused the latent theme of liberation, prominent among certain 19th century and 20th century figures of the black church. And his praxis so crystallized the radical side of the black church's mission that it unwittingly laid the necessary foundation for the emergence of a new phenomenon in black religious history of black theology of liberation. So there's no Cone, there's no James Cone without a Martin Luther King Jr. It just doesn't happen. So these moments, I argue, are connected by a kind of subterranean unity, and they all are part of our ongoing struggle to give voice to an anti-racist appropriation of Christian faith, to give voice to a holistic vision of humanity. So the fourth moment is black theology. I could say a lot more, but I just want to emphasize that black theology had its earliest incarnation among black preachers. There weren't, you could count the black PhDs in religion at that time on one or two hands. Cone and others showed up in 1969 when the National Committee of Black Churchmen, that went through a lot of names, first the National Conference of Negro Churchmen.
Fraternal Council.
No, that's a different group. The NCNC started in 1966. You all probably read thinking about the piece that was taken out of the New York Times, explaining what black power is all about. These were black pastors. So I won't go through all the history, but among them were Baptists like Kelly Miller Smith, who had worked with Dr. King at SCLC. He was the last president of the NCBC. Horace Harris is here, leader of the Kelly Miller Smith Institute. Presbyterians like Edla Hawkins, who headed the Presbyterian Black Caucus. You had all these black caucuses in white denominations emerging around this time. Thinking about policy, demanding reparations, walking into the Riverside Church and demanding, James Foreman demanding reparations. Nathan Wright at the Episcopal Church, the Catholic priest, Father Lawrence Lucas. So let me just read this statement published by the NCNC, the National Committee of Negro Churchmen. Then it became the National Committee of Black Churchmen, eventually the National Conference of Black Christians. 1966, connecting black theology, well, not black theology, but connecting black power to the independent black church movement. They write in 1966 in response to white liberal churchmen who were saying, what's all this black power stuff about? Y'all have turned your back on us. They said, as black men who were long ago forced to create and to will black power, we failed to understand the emotional quality of the outcry of some clergy against the use of the term today. It is not enough to answer that integration is the solution, for it is precisely the nature of the operation of power under some forms of integration which is being challenged. The Negro Church was created as a result of the refusal to submit to the indignities of a false kind of integration in which all power was in the hands of white people. A more equal sharing of power is precisely what is required as the precondition of authentic human interaction. We regard as sheer hypocrisy the view that opposes love to power. Love should be a controlling element in power, not power itself. So long as white churchmen continue to moralize and misinterpret Christian love, so long will justice continue to be subverted in the land. I think it's relevant here. Theological terms, we're talking about power. Here in the Joint Center for Economic and Political Studies, you'll be talking about public policy. We're trying to, what does love look like in the society and how do we organize it? The trained academics came later. James Cone, J.D. Otis Roberts, Gerard Wilmore. And with them, a radical remnant of pastors and theologians emerged together, creating a new moment for the black church. It was a new moment because prior to that point, black churches operated from the assumption that the behavior of white people was wrong in view of their theological claims, but that their theological thinking itself was right. So Richard Allen and others took the creeds, the Book of Discipline, all of that with them. To the contrary, black theologians began to argue that the theological thinking of their white sisters and brothers emerged from their actions, and that those who did not act right did not think right either. And that there was a contradiction to suggest that one could have an incorrect view of humanity, anthropology, and a correct view of God, theology. If your anthropology is wrong, your theology is wrong. And so a new theology emerged arguing that the struggle of the poor, the struggle for the poor, the struggle of the poor for liberation is the central message of the gospel. Of course, womanist theologians emerged as part of the black theology movement, and they began to question the sexism in the black church, conservatism around issues of gender. And they asked the same thing that black theologians, black male theologians were asking: how can your theology be right if your anthropology is wrong? So as we talk about public policy for the black community, we're going to have to work extra hard, given the composition of this room, to keep ourselves honest about half of the black community. And if you talk about black women and children, more than half. And it's so as best we can, and we got to keep the womanist consciousness at least present at this table, test us and challenge us in important ways. And so I'm grateful to Delman for bringing us together in this way, because what I argue for in my upcoming text is a fifth moment. So the first moment is the formation of a liberationist faith, or Christianization. And the second moment is the founding of a liberationist church, or institutionalization. And the third moment is the fomenting of a church-led liberationist movement, or conscientization. And the fourth moment is the forging of a liberationist theology, or systematization. The fifth moment that I argue for is the flowering of a self-critical liberationist community.
Can you repeat that?
The flowering of a self-critical liberationist community. There is this disconnect between black theology, which is the critical questioning side of the black church, which we need, because prior to that moment, prior to black theology, you had much of the studies done on the black church were done by sociologists, historians, and political scientists, and we need that. But theology asks the church, what are you called to do from the standpoint of faith itself? It's faith questioning itself. It gets at the question of, well, what does the gospel call us to do? And so it's a critical theological principle. It's a new moment. And yet there's been this disconnect.